It was a quiet afternoon in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slower pace. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the streets. A young man, dressed in simple clothes, walked down the sidewalk with a calm demeanor. He wasn't in a hurry, and his relaxed posture suggested he was just enjoying the day. But his peaceful stroll was about to be interrupted. A police car pulled up beside him, its tires crunching against the gravel on the side of the road. The window rolled down, and an officer leaned out, his sunglasses hiding his eyes but not the smirk on his face. The young man stopped, turning to face the officer with a polite expression. He wasn't sure why he was being stopped, but he remained calm, waiting for the officer to speak. "Where do you think you're going, kid?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He looked the young man up and down, clearly unimpressed by his appearance. The young man wasn't dressed in fancy clothes or carrying anything unusual, just a simple backpack slung over one shoulder. But the officer seemed to have already made up his mind about him. "Just heading to the library," the young man replied, his voice steady. He didn't raise his voice or show any sign of irritation, even though the officer's tone was far from friendly. The officer chuckled, shaking his head as if he found the answer amusing. "The library, huh? You sure you're not up to something else? You look like you've got better things to do than read books." The young man didn't respond immediately. He knew there was no point in arguing with someone who had already decided to mock him. Instead, he stood there quietly, waiting for the officer to finish his little performance. The officer, however, seemed to take his silence as a sign of weakness. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" the officer taunted, leaning further out of the window. "You know, in this town, we don't take kindly to people who don't respect authority. Maybe you should think twice before wandering around like you own the place." The young man's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet confidence that the officer didn't seem to notice. He simply nodded, acknowledging the officer's words without agreeing or disagreeing. This seemed to irritate the officer even more. "All right, smart guy," the officer said, opening the car door and stepping out. He was a tall man, his uniform neatly pressed, and his badge gleaming in the sunlight. He walked around the car, stopping a few feet away from the young man. "Let's see what you've got in that bag of yours. Maybe you're not as innocent as you look." The young man didn't resist. He slid the backpack off his shoulder and handed it to the officer without a word. The officer took it, his smirk growing wider as he unzipped the bag and started rummaging through its contents. He pulled out a few notebooks, a water bottle, and a small, worn-out wallet. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, his fingers brushed against something else, a small, rectangular object tucked into one of the inner pockets. He pulled it out, his eyebrows raising in surprise. It was an ID card, but not just any ID card. The officer's eyes widened as he read the name and title printed on it. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of shock. He looked up at the young man, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The young man, still calm and composed, reached out and took the ID card from the officer's trembling hand. He slipped it back into his bag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is there anything else, officer?" the young man asked, his voice as calm as ever. The officer shook his head, his earlier confidence completely gone. He handed the backpack back to the young man, his hand slightly unsteady. "No, sir," the officer stammered, his tone completely different now. "I mean, no, there's nothing else. You're free to go." The young man nodded, slinging the backpack over his shoulder once more. He gave the officer a small, polite smile before turning and continuing his walk down the sidewalk. The officer stood there for a moment, watching him go, before quickly getting back into his car and driving away. As the young man walked, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. He had known this would happen, not because he had planned it, but because he had learned long ago that people often judged others based on appearances. He didn't hold it against the officer. He knew that not everyone could see beyond the surface. But he also knew that sometimes, it was important to remind people that there was more to a person than what met the eye. The library was just a few blocks away, and he was looking forward to spending the afternoon there. He had always loved books, loved the way they could transport you to different worlds and teach you things you never knew. Today, he was planning to dive into a new novel he had been wanting to read for weeks. But as he walked, his mind kept drifting back to the encounter with the officer. He wondered if the officer would treat others differently now, or if he would go back to his old ways. He hoped it was the former, but he knew that change didn't happen overnight. Still, he felt a small sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the officer had learned something today. As he reached the library, he pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. He had a book to read, and he wasn't going to let anything distract him from that. He walked through the doors, the familiar scent of old books greeting him like an old friend. He found a quiet corner, settled into a comfortable chair, and opened his book, losing himself in its pages. Meanwhile, the officer was driving back to the station, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his assumptions. But now, he felt like a fool. He had mocked the young man, only to find out that he was someone far more important than he had ever imagined. As he parked the car and walked into the station, he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that was gnawing at him. He had always prided himself on being a good officer, someone who protected and served the community. But today, he had let his biases get the better of him. He knew he needed to do better, to be better. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the encounter with the young man stayed with him. It was a reminder that he still had a lot to learn, that he couldn't judge people based on appearances alone. And as he sat at his desk, filling out paperwork, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do better. He would be better. And maybe, just maybe, he would get a chance to apologize to the young man someday. But for now, he would focus on being the kind of officer who truly served and protected everyone, no matter who they were or what they looked like. The young man spent the rest of the afternoon at the library, completely absorbed in his book. Time seemed to fly by as he turned page after page, lost in the story. The library was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of paper or the soft footsteps of someone walking by. It was the perfect place to escape from the world, even if just for a little while. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the library windows, the young man finally closed his book. He stretched his arms, feeling a sense of contentment. It had been a good day, despite the earlier encounter with the officer. He packed his things, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and made his way to the exit. Outside, the town was bathed in the warm hues of the evening. The streets were quieter now, with only a few people out and about. The young man walked slowly, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. He wasn't in a rush to get home, he liked taking his time, observing the world around him. As he turned a corner, he noticed a small park up ahead. It was a modest space, with a few benches, a playground, and a couple of trees providing shade. He decided to take a detour and sit for a while, just to enjoy the evening air. He found an empty bench and sat down, placing his backpack beside him. He had only been sitting for a few minutes when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw the same officer from earlier walking towards him. The officer looked different now, his earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a more subdued demeanor. He stopped a few feet away from the bench, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Mind if I join you?" the officer asked, his voice much softer than before. The young man nodded, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. The officer sat down, keeping a respectful distance between them. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The officer seemed to be gathering his thoughts, while the young man waited patiently, sensing that the officer had something to say. Finally, the officer broke the silence. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice sincere. "For earlier. I was out of line, and I'm sorry." The young man nodded, accepting the apology without hesitation. "It's okay," he replied. "We all make mistakes." The officer looked surprised by the young man's response. He had expected some resistance, maybe even a bit of anger. But the young man's calm and forgiving attitude caught him off guard. "You're not what I expected," the officer admitted, his tone reflecting his genuine surprise. "I judged you based on how you looked, and I was wrong. I should have known better." The young man smiled faintly. "It's easy to judge people based on appearances," he said. "But sometimes, it's worth taking a moment to look deeper." The officer nodded, feeling a sense of relief. He had been carrying the weight of his earlier actions all day, and the young man's forgiveness lifted a burden he hadn't realized was so heavy. "Can I ask you something?" the officer said after a pause. The young man nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Why didn't you say anything earlier? When I was mocking you, you didn't defend yourself. You just let it happen." The young man thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes, words aren't necessary," he said. "Actions speak louder. I knew that sooner or later, you'd see the truth. And I didn't want to escalate the situation. It's better to stay calm and let people figure things out on their own." The officer was struck by the young man's wisdom. He had been in law enforcement for years, dealing with all kinds of people, but he had never met someone so composed and understanding. It made him realize how much he still had to learn. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," the officer said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've got a way of seeing the world that's different. In a good way." The young man chuckled softly. "I've just learned to take things as they come," he said. "Life is too short to hold on to anger or grudges. It's better to focus on the positive and try to make a difference, even in small ways." The officer nodded, feeling a sense of respect for the young man that he hadn't felt before. He realized that he had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to learn from someone who saw the world in a way he never had. "I want to do better," the officer said, his voice firm with determination. "I want to be the kind of officer who truly serves and protects everyone, no matter who they are. I don't want to make the same mistakes again." The young man smiled, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride. "That's a good goal," he said. "Change starts with small steps. If you can make a difference in even one person's life, it's worth it." The officer felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always thought of himself as a good officer, but now he realized that there was always room for improvement. He wanted to be better, not just for himself, but for the community he served. As the evening deepened, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. The park was quiet, with only the occasional sound of birds chirping or leaves rustling in the breeze. It was a peaceful moment, one that neither of them would forget. Finally, the officer stood up, feeling a sense of closure. "Thank you," he said, extending his hand to the young man. "For giving me a second chance. I won't forget this." The young man shook his hand, his grip firm but friendly. "Take care," he said simply. "And good luck." The officer nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude as he walked away. He knew that this encounter had changed him in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. But he was determined to make the most of it, to be the kind of person who truly made a difference. As the young man watched the officer leave, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He hadn't set out to change anyone's life, but he was glad that he had been able to make a positive impact. He knew that the world needed more kindness and understanding, and he was happy to play his part, no matter how small. He sat on the bench for a little while longer, enjoying the peace and quiet. The sun had set completely now, and the park was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was a beautiful evening, and he felt content, knowing that he had made a difference in his own quiet way. Finally, he stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He had a long walk home, but he didn't mind. He liked the quiet of the evening, the way the world seemed to slow down as the day came to an end. As he walked, he thought about the officer and the conversation they had shared. He hoped that the officer would stay true to his word, that he would strive to be better and make a positive impact in the community. But even if he didn't, the young man knew that he had done his part. And that was enough. The night was cool and calm, and the young man felt at peace as he made his way home. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready for whatever came his way. The next morning, the young man woke up early, as he always did. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the town. He liked this time of day, the quiet before the world fully woke up. It gave him a chance to gather his thoughts and prepare for the day ahead. After a simple breakfast, he grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. He had a lot to do today, but he wasn't in a rush. He walked at his usual pace, taking in the sights and sounds of the town as it slowly came to life. Shopkeepers were opening their stores, children were walking to school, and the occasional car drove by. It was a peaceful scene, one that he never tired of. As he walked, he thought about the previous day's events. The encounter with the officer had been unexpected, but it had ended on a positive note. He hoped that the officer would take the lesson to heart and strive to be better. But he also knew that change wasn't easy, and it would take time. His first stop of the day was the community center. It was a place he visited often, as he volunteered there regularly. The center offered various programs for the townspeople, from after-school activities for kids to support groups for adults. It was a hub of activity, and the young man enjoyed being a part of it. When he arrived, he was greeted by the center's director, a kind-hearted woman who had been running the place for years. She smiled warmly when she saw him. "Good morning. I'm glad you're here. We've got a busy day ahead." The young man returned the smile. "Good morning. What's on the agenda today?" The director handed him a list of tasks. "We've got a group of kids coming in for a reading session this morning, and then we've got a community meeting in the afternoon. I could use your help with both." He nodded, ready to get to work. The reading session was one of his favorite activities. He loved seeing the kids' faces light up as they discovered new stories and ideas. It was a reminder of how powerful books could be, how they could open up new worlds and inspire imagination. As the kids began to arrive, the young man greeted each one with a smile. He helped them find seats and handed out books, making sure everyone had something they would enjoy. The session went smoothly, with the kids eagerly listening as he read aloud. He made the stories come alive, using different voices and expressions to keep them engaged. After the session, the kids thanked him and headed off to their next activity. The young man felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had made a difference, even if it was just for a few hours. He spent the rest of the morning helping out around the center, doing whatever needed to be done. In the afternoon, the community meeting began. It was a chance for the townspeople to come together and discuss issues affecting the community. The young man sat in the back, listening intently as people shared their thoughts and ideas. He didn't speak much, preferring to observe and take everything in. One of the topics that came up was the relationship between the police and the community. Some people expressed concerns about how certain officers treated them, while others shared positive experiences. The young man listened carefully, noting the different perspectives. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and addressed the room. "I think it's important to remember that everyone has the capacity to change," he said. "We've all made mistakes, but what matters is how we learn from them and strive to do better. I've had my own experiences, both good and bad, but I believe that if we work together, we can build a stronger, more understanding community." His words resonated with the group, and many people nodded in agreement. The director smiled at him, clearly proud of his thoughtful contribution. The meeting continued, with more people sharing their ideas and suggestions. As the meeting came to an end, the young man felt a sense of hope. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he believed that every small step counted. He was glad to be a part of a community that was willing to come together and work towards a better future. After the meeting, he spent some time talking with the director and a few other volunteers. They discussed plans for upcoming events and how they could continue to make a positive impact. The young man offered his ideas and listened to theirs, feeling a sense of camaraderie. As the day drew to a close, he packed up his things and said his goodbyes. He had one more stop to make before heading home. He wanted to check in on an elderly neighbor who lived a few blocks away. The neighbor was a kind, old man who lived alone and often needed help with small tasks. When he arrived, the old man greeted him with a smile. "It's good to see you," he said. "I was just about to make some tea. Would you like to join me?" The young man nodded, happy to spend some time with his neighbor. They sat in the old man's cozy kitchen, sipping tea and chatting about everything from the weather to the latest town gossip. The old man had a wealth of stories to share, and the young man enjoyed listening to them. After a while, the young man helped the old man with a few chores around the house. He fixed a leaky faucet, replaced a light bulb, and carried some groceries inside. The old man was grateful, thanking him profusely. "You're a good kid," the old man said as the young man prepared to leave. "The world needs more people like you." The young man smiled, feeling a sense of warmth. "It's my pleasure," he said. "I'll stop by again soon." As he walked home, he thought about the day's events. It had been a busy but fulfilling day, filled with meaningful interactions and small acts of kindness. He knew that these moments might seem insignificant to some, but to him, they were what made life worth living. When he finally reached his house, he felt a sense of contentment. He had done his part to make the world a little better, and that was enough. As he lay down to sleep that night, he felt at peace, knowing that he was living his life with purpose and integrity. The following day, the young man woke up to the sound of rain tapping gently against his window. The sky was overcast, and the town was blanketed in a soft, gray light. He didn't mind the rain, it brought a sense of calm and freshness to the air. After a quick breakfast, he grabbed his umbrella and headed out, ready to face whatever the day had in store. His first stop was the local grocery store. He needed to pick up a few things for the week, and he also wanted to check in on the store owner, an older woman who had become a friend over the years. The store was a small, family-run business, and the young man liked supporting it whenever he could. When he walked in, the bell above the door jingled softly. The store owner looked up from behind the counter and smiled when she saw him. "Good morning. You're out early today." "Good morning," he replied, shaking the rain off his umbrella. "Just thought I'd get a head start on the day. How's everything here?" The store owner sighed, but her smile remained. "Oh, you know how it is. Business has been slow lately, but we're managing. It's always nice to see a friendly face." The young man nodded, understanding her struggles. Small businesses like hers were the heart of the community, but they often faced challenges. He made a mental note to spread the word and encourage others to shop there. As he browsed the aisles, picking up the items he needed, he noticed a young boy standing near the candy section, looking longingly at the shelves. The boy's clothes were worn, and he seemed to be alone. The young man approached him gently, not wanting to startle him. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. I was just looking," he mumbled, clearly embarrassed. The young man smiled reassuringly. "It's okay. I used to love looking at the candy when I was your age. Do you want to pick something out?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't have any money." The young man's heart went out to the boy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. "Here," he said, handing them to the boy. "Why don't you get something for yourself?" The boy's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, carefully selecting a small candy bar. He clutched it tightly, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The young man patted the boy on the shoulder. "You're welcome. Enjoy it." As the boy ran off, the young man felt a sense of satisfaction. It was a small gesture, but he knew it had made a difference to the boy. He finished his shopping and headed to the counter to pay. The store owner rang up his items, her smile warm. "You've got a good heart," she said. "The world needs more people like you." The young man shrugged modestly. "I just try to do what I can," he said. "Take care, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help." As he left the store, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the air smelled fresh and clean. He decided to take a longer route home, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. As he walked, he noticed a commotion up ahead. A small crowd had gathered near the park, and he could hear raised voices. Curious, he quickened his pace to see what was going on. When he reached the park, he saw the same officer from the other day standing in the middle of the crowd. The officer was trying to calm down a man who was clearly upset, but the man was shouting and gesturing wildly. The crowd watched nervously, unsure of what to do. The young man recognized the man as someone who often hung around the park. He was known to have a temper, but he was usually harmless. The young man stepped forward, hoping to help defuse the situation. "Hey," he said, addressing the man in a calm, steady voice. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" The man turned to him, his face red with anger. "This cop's trying to tell me what to do," he shouted. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." The officer looked relieved to see the young man. "I was just asking him to move along," he explained. He was causing a disturbance, and people were getting worried. The young man nodded, understanding both sides. He turned back to the man, his tone gentle but firm. "I get it," he said. "But maybe it's better to take a walk and cool off. No one wants things to escalate, right?" The man hesitated, his anger slowly fading. He looked around at the crowd, then back at the young man. Yeah, maybe you're right," he muttered. He shoved his hands in his pockets and walked away, muttering under his breath. The crowd began to disperse, relieved that the situation had been resolved peacefully. The officer approached the young man, his expression a mix of gratitude and admiration. "Thanks," he said. "I don't know how you do it, but you've got a way with people." The young man smiled. "It's all about listening and understanding," he said. "Everyone just wants to be heard." The officer nodded, clearly taking the words to heart. "I'm still learning," he admitted. "But I'm trying. Thanks for showing me how it's done." The young man patted the officer on the shoulder. "You're doing fine. Just keep at it." As the officer walked away, the young man felt a sense of pride. He knew that change was a slow process, but every small step counted. He was glad to have been able to help, even in a small way. The rest of the day passed quietly. The young man spent the afternoon at home, catching up on some reading and taking care of a few chores. As the evening approached, he decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The rain had stopped, and the streets were glistening in the fading light. He walked slowly, enjoying the peace and quiet. As he passed by the park, he noticed the officer sitting on a bench, deep in thought. The young man hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down beside him. "Everything okay?" he asked. The officer looked up, surprised to see him. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "Just thinking about everything that's happened lately. You've given me a lot to think about." The young man nodded, understanding. "It's not easy to change," he said. "But it's worth it." The officer smiled faintly. "You're right. And I'm going to keep trying. Thanks for everything." The young man returned the smile. Anytime. As they sat there in companionable silence, the young man felt a sense of connection. He knew that the officer was on the right path, and he was glad to have been a part of his journey. When it was time to go, the young man stood up and stretched. "Take care," he said. "And remember, it's the small steps that count." The officer nodded, his expression determined. "I will. Thanks again." As the young man walked home, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that he was making a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. And that was enough. The next morning, the young man woke up to a crisp, sunny day. The rain from the previous day had left the town looking fresh and vibrant, with the sunlight glinting off the wet streets. He felt a sense of energy and purpose as he got ready for the day. There was something about the clear skies that made him feel like anything was possible. After a quick breakfast, he decided to visit the local school. He had been invited to speak to a class about the importance of community and kindness. It wasn't something he had done before, but he was eager to share his thoughts with the younger generation. He believed that if kids learned early about the value of empathy and understanding, they could grow up to make the world a better place. When he arrived at the school, he was greeted by the teacher, a warm and enthusiastic woman who had been a long-time supporter of his efforts in the community. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, shaking his hand. "The kids are really excited to hear from you." The young man smiled. "I'm happy to be here. I hope I can make a difference." The teacher led him to the classroom, where a group of curious faces looked up at him as he entered. The kids ranged in age from about 8 to 10, and they seemed eager to hear what he had to say. He took a deep breath, feeling a bit nervous but also excited. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice calm and friendly. "I'm here today to talk to you about something really important: kindness and community. These are things that might seem small, but they can have a big impact on the world around us." The kids listened intently as he spoke, their eyes wide with interest. He shared stories from his own experiences, like the time he helped the elderly neighbor or the encounter with the officer. He explained how small acts of kindness could ripple out and affect others in ways we might not even realize. "It's not about doing big, grand things," he said. "It's about the little things, helping someone carry their groceries, saying hello to a neighbor, or even just smiling at someone who looks like they're having a bad day. Those small actions can make a big difference." One of the kids raised their hand. "But what if someone is mean to you? Should you still be kind?" The young man nodded, appreciating the question. "That's a great point. Sometimes, people might not be kind to us, and that can be hard. But I've learned that responding with kindness can often change the situation. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." Another child chimed in. "What if they don't change? What if they're still mean?" The young man smiled. "That's a possibility. But even if they don't change, you'll know that you did the right thing. And sometimes, people just need time. Kindness can plant a seed, even if it takes a while to grow." The kids seemed to absorb his words, their faces thoughtful. The teacher smiled, clearly pleased with how the discussion was going. "Does anyone else have questions?" she asked. A shy-looking girl raised her hand. "How do you know when you're making a difference?" The young man thought for a moment before answering. "That's a really good question. Sometimes, you might not know right away. But if you keep doing kind things, you'll start to see the impact, maybe in the way people smile at you, or in the way your community feels a little brighter. It's not always obvious, but it's there." The kids nodded, seeming to understand. The young man felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had sparked something in them. He hoped that they would carry these lessons with them as they grew up. After the class, the teacher thanked him again. "You really made an impression on them," she said. "I can tell they'll be thinking about what you said for a long time." The young man smiled. "I'm glad. They're the future, after all. If we can teach them to be kind and understanding, the world will be a better place. As he left the school, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The morning had gone better than he had expected, and he was grateful for the opportunity to share his thoughts. He decided to take a walk through the park before heading home, enjoying the sunshine and the fresh air. As he walked, he noticed the officer from the previous days sitting on a bench, looking deep in thought. The young man hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down beside him. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" The officer looked up, surprised to see him. "Oh, hey. Yeah, I'm just thinking. I had a rough morning. Had to deal with a situation that didn't go the way I wanted." The young man nodded, understanding. "Do you want to talk about it?" The officer sighed. "It's just. I'm trying to do better, like we talked about. But sometimes, it feels like no matter what I do, it's not enough. People still see me as the bad guy." The young man listened carefully, his expression empathetic. "Change takes time," he said. "And it's not always easy. But the fact that you're trying is what matters. People will notice, even if it's not right away." The officer looked at him, his expression a mix of frustration and hope. "I just want to make a difference, you know? I want to be the kind of officer people can trust." "You will be," the young man said firmly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and doing your best. And from what I've seen, you're on the right path." The officer smiled faintly, seeming to take comfort in the young man's words. "Thanks. I needed to hear that." They sat in silence for a while, watching the park come to life as people strolled by, enjoying the sunny day. The young man felt a sense of connection with the officer, knowing that they were both trying to make a difference in their own ways. Finally, the officer stood up, his expression more determined. "I've got to get back to work," he said. "But thanks for talking to me. It helps." The young man nodded. "Anytime. Take care." As the officer walked away, the young man felt a sense of pride. He knew that change was a slow process, but he believed in the power of small steps. He was glad to have been able to offer some encouragement. The rest of the day passed quietly. The young man spent the afternoon at home, reflecting on the morning's events. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was making a difference, one conversation at a time. As the sun set, he sat by his window, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. He thought about the kids he had spoken to, the officer, and all the people he had interacted with over the past few days. Each encounter had been meaningful in its own way, and he was grateful for the connections he had made. He knew that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. With kindness, understanding, and a willingness to listen, he believed that he could continue to make a positive impact. And that was enough. The next few days passed in a blur of small, meaningful moments. The young man continued his routine, helping out at the community center, visiting his elderly neighbor, and spending time at the library. But something felt different now, like the town itself was shifting, even if only slightly. People seemed a little kinder, a little more aware of one another. He liked to think that his actions, small as they were, had played a part in that. One afternoon, as he was leaving the community center, he ran into the officer again. This time, the officer looked more relaxed, almost cheerful. He waved as he approached, a genuine smile on his face. "Hey," the officer said. "I was hoping I'd run into you. I wanted to tell you something." The young man smiled back, curious. "What's on your mind?" The officer hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been trying to do things differently, like we talked about. And, well, it's working. Slowly, but it's working. People are starting to trust me more. I even had a kid wave at me today instead of running away." The young man's smile widened. "That's great. I'm really happy to hear that. The officer nodded, his expression grateful. It's because of you. You showed me that it's possible to make a difference, even in small ways. I just wanted to say thank you. The young man felt a warm sense of pride. You're the one doing the work, he said. I just gave you a little push. But I'm glad I could help. They stood there for a moment, the air between them filled with a quiet understanding. The officer seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The young man was glad to see it. Well, I'd better get back to it, the officer said, adjusting his hat. But I'll see you around, okay? Of course, the young man replied. Take care. As the officer walked away, the young man felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It was moments like these that reminded him why he did what he did, why he believed in kindness, in understanding, in the power of small actions. He knew that change wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Later that evening, as he was walking home, he noticed a group of kids playing in the park. They were laughing and running around, their voices carrying through the cool evening air. He recognized one of them as the boy he had helped at the grocery store a few days earlier. The boy spotted him and waved enthusiastically. Hey, the boy called, running over. Remember me? The young man smiled. Of course I do. How are you? The boy grinned. I'm good. Thanks again for the candy. It was the best thing ever. The young man chuckled. I'm glad you enjoyed it. What are you up to today? The boy pointed to his friends, who were still playing nearby. We're just hanging out. Do you want to join us? The young man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sure, why not? He spent the next hour playing with the kids, laughing and running around like he was one of them. It was a simple, joyful moment, and it reminded him of the importance of connection. The kids didn't care about his past or his struggles, they just saw him as someone who was kind and fun to be around. And that was enough. As the sun began to set, the kids started heading home. The boy he had helped earlier lingered for a moment, looking up at him with a serious expression. You're really cool, the boy said. I want to be like you when I grow up. The young man felt a lump in his throat. He crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy. You know what? You already are. You're kind, and you care about people. That's what matters. The boy smiled, his eyes shining. Thanks. I'll remember that. As the boy ran off to join his friends, the young man stood there for a moment, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that he wasn't perfect, that he still had a lot to learn. But moments like these reminded him that he was on the right path. The next morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose. He had a lot to do, but he was ready for it. After a quick breakfast, he headed to the library, where he had promised to help organize a book drive. The library was a place he loved, and he was happy to contribute in any way he could. When he arrived, the librarian greeted him with a smile. Good morning. Thanks for coming. We've got a lot of books to sort through. The young man nodded, rolling up his sleeves. No problem. Let's get to work. They spent the next few hours sorting through boxes of donated books, organizing them by genre and age group. It was tedious work, but the young man didn't mind. He enjoyed the quiet rhythm of it, the sense of accomplishment as each box was finished. As they worked, the librarian struck up a conversation. You know, you've made quite an impact on this town, she said. People talk about you, you know. In a good way. The young man looked up, surprised. Really? I'm just doing what I can. The librarian smiled. That's the thing. You don't realize how much it means to people. You've shown us that even small actions can make a big difference. It's inspiring. The young man felt a warm sense of gratitude. Thank you. That means a lot to me. They continued working in companionable silence, the hours passing quickly. By the time they were done, the library was filled with neatly organized stacks of books, ready for the community to enjoy. The young man felt a sense of pride as he looked around. "Thanks for your help," the librarian said as they finished up. "We couldn't have done it without you." The young man smiled. "It was my pleasure. Let me know if you need help with anything else." As he left the library, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The day had been long, but it had been worth it. He knew that he was making a difference, one small action at a time. That evening, as he sat by his window, watching the stars come out, he thought about everything that had happened over the past few days. He thought about the officer, the boy, the librarian, and all the other people he had interacted with. Each encounter had been meaningful in its own way, and he was grateful for the connections he had made. He knew that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. With kindness, understanding, and a willingness to listen, he believed that he could continue to make a positive impact. And that was enough. The days continued to roll by, each one bringing its own set of challenges and rewards. The young man kept to his routine, but he noticed that more and more people were starting to approach him, not just for help, but to share their own stories and experiences. It was as if his small acts of kindness had sparked something in the community, a ripple effect that was slowly spreading. One morning, as he was walking to the community center, he noticed a woman sitting on a bench, looking distressed. She was clutching a piece of paper in her hands, her eyes filled with worry. The young man hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down beside her. "Is everything okay?" he asked gently. The woman looked up, startled. She hesitated, then nodded. I'm just trying to figure something out," she said, her voice trembling. "I got this letter, and I don't know what to do." The young man glanced at the paper in her hands. It looked like an official document, filled with legal jargon. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. The woman hesitated again, then sighed. "It's about my son. He's been having some trouble at school, and now they're saying he might get expelled. I don't know how to help him." The young man listened carefully, his expression empathetic. "That sounds really tough. Have you talked to the school about it?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know what to say. I'm not good with these kinds of things." The young man thought for a moment. "Would you like some help? I could go with you to the school and see if we can figure something out." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "You'd do that for me?" He nodded. "Of course. Sometimes, it helps to have someone there with you." The woman looked relieved, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without your help." They arranged to meet later that afternoon at the school. The young man spent the rest of the morning at the community center, helping out with various tasks. But his mind kept drifting back to the woman and her son. He knew how overwhelming these situations could be, and he was glad he could offer some support. When the time came, he met the woman at the school. She looked nervous, but he gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out together," he said. They went inside and were directed to the principal's office. The principal, a stern-looking man, greeted them with a polite but reserved expression. "What can I do for you?" he asked. The woman hesitated, so the young man stepped in. "We're here to talk about her son," he said. "We understand there have been some issues, and we'd like to see if we can find a solution." The principal nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I see. Well, let's discuss it." They spent the next hour talking about the boy's behavior, his struggles, and what could be done to help him. The young man listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions. By the end of the meeting, they had come up with a plan, a combination of counseling, extra support, and regular check-ins to ensure the boy was on the right track. As they left the school, the woman looked at the young man with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. I don't know how to repay you. He smiled. You don't have to. Just take care of your son, and let me know if you need anything else. The woman nodded, her gratitude evident. I will. Thank you so much. As he walked home that evening, the young man felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that he had made a difference, not just for the woman, but for her son as well. It was moments like these that reminded him why he did what he did. The next day, he decided to visit the park again. It had become a place of reflection for him, a spot where he could sit and think about everything that had happened. As he walked through the park, he noticed the officer sitting on a bench, looking deep in thought. The young man hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down beside him. Hey, he said. Everything okay? The officer looked up, surprised to see him. Oh, hey. Yeah, I'm just thinking. I had a rough morning. Had to deal with a situation that didn't go the way I wanted. The young man nodded, understanding. Do you want to talk about it? The officer sighed. It's just. I'm trying to do better, like we talked about. But sometimes, it feels like no matter what I do, it's not enough. People still see me as the bad guy. The young man listened carefully, his expression empathetic. Change takes time, he said. And it's not always easy. But the fact that you're trying is what matters. People will notice, even if it's not right away. The officer looked at him, his expression a mix of frustration and hope. I just want to make a difference, you know? I want to be the kind of officer people can trust. You will be, the young man said firmly. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and doing your best. And from what I've seen, you're on the right path. The officer smiled faintly, seeming to take comfort in the young man's words. Thanks. I needed to hear that. They sat in silence for a while, watching the park come to life as people strolled by, enjoying the sunny day. The young man felt a sense of connection with the officer, knowing that they were both trying to make a difference in their own ways. Finally, the officer stood up, his expression more determined. I've got to get back to work, he said. But thanks for talking to me. It helps. The young man nodded. Anytime. Take care. As the officer walked away, the young man felt a sense of pride. He knew that change was a slow process, but he believed in the power of small steps. He was glad to have been able to offer some encouragement. The rest of the day passed quietly. The young man spent the afternoon at home, reflecting on the morning's events. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was making a difference, one conversation at a time. As the sun set, he sat by his window, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. He thought about the woman and her son, the officer, and all the people he had interacted with over the past few days. Each encounter had been meaningful in its own way, and he was grateful for the connections he had made. He knew that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. With kindness, understanding, and a willingness to listen, he believed that he could continue to make a positive impact. And that was enough. The young man's days continued to be filled with small, meaningful interactions. He had become a familiar face in the town, someone people turned to for help, advice, or simply a kind word. He didn't mind, it was what he loved most about his life. He felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that he was making a difference, even in small ways. One afternoon, as he was leaving the library, he noticed a group of teenagers hanging out near the entrance. They were laughing and joking, but something about their demeanor caught his attention. One of them, a tall boy with a serious expression, seemed to be the leader of the group. The young man recognized him as someone who had been in trouble before, but he also knew that there was more to the boy than met the eye. He approached the group, his tone friendly. Hey, how's it going? The teenagers looked up, surprised to see him. The tall boy crossed his arms, his expression guarded. What do you want? The young man smiled, unfazed by the boy's tone. "Just saying hi. You guys look like you're having fun." The boy shrugged, but the others seemed more open. One of them, a girl with bright eyes, smiled at him. "We're just hanging out. What about you?" "I was at the library," he said. "Doing some reading. You guys ever go in there?" The girl nodded. "Sometimes. It's kind of boring, though." The young man chuckled. "It can be, but there's a lot of cool stuff in there too. You just have to find what interests you." The tall boy rolled his eyes. "Whatever. We've got better things to do." The young man looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Like what?" The boy hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know. Just, stuff." The young man nodded, understanding. "I get it. But if you ever want to try something different, let me know. There's a lot of cool stuff out there." The boy didn't respond, but the young man could see a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, but he believed that even a small spark could grow into something bigger. As he walked away, he felt a sense of hope. He knew that the teenagers were at a crossroads, and he hoped that he had planted a seed that might one day grow.